It is August 1598, and after 5 years of war, the English crown's attempts to conquer the Irish province of Ulster are at a dismal low. While the crown's presence in Ireland dates back to the Norman invasions of the 12th century, by the time of the Tudor regime, the Irish lords have beaten the once dominant English-controlled areas back to the confines of Dublin, the area known as the Pale, with everything beyond it under the rule of local Gaelic or Hiberno Norman chieftains. Starting with the reign of Mary I in the 1550s, the English government has attempted to use a policy of colonial plantation to bring recalcitrant areas under control. And it was the threat of these efforts at population transfer that pushed the northernmost lords of Ulster, Hugh Roe O'Donnell of Tyrconnell and Hugh O'Neill of Tyrone, into outright rebellion. Like many of the Gaelic lords, O'Neill and O'Donnell had courted the crown authorities, paying lip service to Queen Elizabeth I's authority, and their loyalty had been effectively bought in return for inactivity. But both O'Neill and O'Donnell were unwilling in any degree to lose their ancient privileges and sovereignty in their domains, and it was inevitable that the ongoing Tudor attempts to pacify and re-establish English control in Ireland would eventually clash with their interests. O'Donnell and other Gaelic clan chiefs like Hugh Maguire had entered upon war in the early 1590s with the rumoured support of O'Neill. But when the Lord Deputy of Ireland, William Fitzwilliam, made public his wish for Ulster to be transformed to an anglicised shire system under the governorship of Henry Bagenal, an English settler with lands in Newry, O'Neill too came out in defiant opposition. Bagenal and O'Neill had a history together, for O'Neill had eloped with Bagenal's sister, Mabel, and it is likely that the English colonialist welcomed the chance to finally subdue the unruly and independent Irish lord. But the duo's first joust in May 1595 took all of the Crown government in Ireland, the royal court in London, and most of all Bagenal himself by surprise. The rumblings of insurgents begin to grow louder across the countryside as bells toll for vengeance. Bellwright is a single-player or co-op open-world medieval strategy survival sim game where you, as the player, are charged with picking up the pieces of your past and bringing justice to a broken nation. In childhood, you were framed for the assassination of the Crown Prince, and in order to save your life were shepherded out of the country by a family friend. Years later, when this family friend is mysteriously killed, you return to your homeland to find answers and liberate your country from corrupt powers. Built in Unreal Engine 5, this gorgeous, sprawling open world is where you'll work your way up from a tiny settlement to the acting leader of a full-fledged rebellion, deal with threats in different regions to gain renown, and acquire new resources to further the technologies of your towns and strengthen your cause. Add recruits as companions to complete quests, or assign them to build, craft, or hunt in order to expand your settlement. Eventually, you will lead your army into battle with different strategies, formations, and tactics, employing various weapon types and equipment to take down the Crown. Level up your attributes and weapon mastery to improve your survival skills and increase your influence as an army commander. Establish and expand your own settlements, liberate the land by assisting its villagers, and recruit others to your cause while learning more about the life you had to leave behind. Bellwright is out now in early access on Steam. Check the link in the description of this video for more information. While riding to reinforce the garrison at Monaghan Castle, then under siege by the Confederate Irish, Bagenal's army of almost 1,800 men were fired on by Irish forces, likely numbering in the hundreds, and the resulting engagement lasted for 4 hours. Casualties were few, however, and ambushes were common in the wilds of Ulster. Bagenal was satisfied that the skirmish had shown that his army was superior to any Gaelic contingent in the province. His army lifted the siege of Monaghan town and resupplied the defenders, providing them with reinforcements. The next day, content that the Irish forces had withdrawn from the area, Bagenal moved his force east to Newry. It had travelled barely 5 miles, passing near the village of Clontibret, a countryside dotted with low drumlins, ideal for the concealment of large bodies of troops, as well as woods and marshy bogs. Then, under ambush, far exceeding the first in intensity, rained gunfire down on the complacent column. Bagenal's English force was caught in a murderous crossfire from 3 directions, the front and both sides of the trail, and his pike infantry, musketeers and cavalry were sliced through in equal measure. Seeing that the Irish fired in rapid, precisely aimed salvos, using both caliver arquebuses and modern muskets, was an appalling revelation to the column's commander. From his position in the ditch, Bagenal saw the figure of O'Neill astride his horse, watching the proceedings as his clansmen and allies tore holes in the invaders' companies. The smell of powder and terrified screams filled the air. Bagenal's entire force was in danger of annihilation, and hundreds were already dead. Only a heroic action by an English cavalry cornet named Sedgrave saved the lives of the relief column. Sedgrave mustered and led a mounted charge of 40 men at O'Neill's position, taking the Gaelic leader and his companies by surprise, and lifting the attention of the Irish from the main body of the column momentarily. Bagenal was able to get the greater part of his surviving units racing toward shelter, while Sedgrave managed to reach O'Neill himself and grab the Irish leader by the neck. It was a brave but suicidal action, for one of O'Neill's bodyguards by the name of O'Kane severed the Englishman's arm, and O'Neill himself stabbed Sedgrave in the groin. Sedgrave had saved Bagenal with his sacrifice, but on his way back to Newry, the general and the rest of the English administration came to a sobering realization. Half of Bagenal's host lay dead, and O'Neill had attacked it with an army of 4,000 men, twice the size of Bagenal's original relief army. Not only that, but O'Neill's men had stood and fought with modern firearms, discharged at a steady, practiced rate of fire, as well as ruinous accuracy. The chief of Tyrone had, in short, created a modern field army in the depths of Ulster, and after decades of turmoil and near extinction, the English colonization of Ireland now faced an unprecedented menace. Medieval Gaelic armies were traditionally manned by a mixture of Galloglas, armoured axe and swordsmen predominantly of Scots Gaelic origin, and Kern, Irish infantrymen who were lightly armoured and carried spears and sword, along with a bow and short knife. The shared culture between the Scots and Irish meant that intermarriage was relatively common, and Galloglas were often given as part of a dowry. By the time that Hugh O'Neill had taken power in Tyrconnell, firearms had been known in Ireland for centuries, but the Galloglas-Kern armies remained predominant. This began to change toward the end of the 16th century, but one of the more dramatic accelerants in Irish military culture was the failure of the Spanish Armada in 1588. After around 20 to 30 of Philippe II's ships broke or landed on the west coast of Ireland, many of the sailors and army personnel who attempted to find shelter were killed. But the more enterprising Gaelic lords defied the English directive to execute every Spaniard, and instead took them on as captains to train their own armies. O'Neill even went so far as to foster contacts with the Spanish government of his fellow Catholic, Philippe II, as well as making use of Spanish expertise in the pike and shot armies of modern warfare. Along with receiving Spanish supplies and advisors, he also bought large amounts of gunpowder and firearms from the Kingdom of Scotland and established an armaments factory at his base in Dungannon. As an ostensible vassal of the English crown before the rebellion, O'Neill was limited in the number of armed retainers he could employ in his household guard. He conveniently sidestepped this limit by operating a system of rotation among his soldiery, effectively conscripting his feudal retainers for a limited time, training them in the use of weaponry, and then calling up a new allocation some months later. His army also incorporated cavalry with capable riders, but Gaelic cavalry operated more as a reconnaissance and skirmishing arm than a concentrated body making use of devastating charges. Similarly, targeteers, which were infantrymen armed with sword and shield, were used by O'Neill as a human shield to protect his musketeers, but they lacked the ability to mount an attack of such destructive impact as Galloglas. O'Neill's military strategy depended on mobility, the capacity to move quickly about the inhospitable terrain of his province and enact shattering attacks on his larger and less mobile opponents, before withdrawing swiftly to the security of the landscape once more. By opening up his recruitment levy to all members of Gaelic society, he also created an unprecedented pool of reserves who could be drawn on with the advent of war. Combined with the substantial incomes he made from his holdings and clan affiliations, O'Neill had an income of £80,000 a year and a potential field army of 8,000, roughly the same size as the army that Elizabeth I's grandfather Henry VII had used to seize the English throne at the Battle of Bosworth a century earlier. Famously, O'Neill also took abundant deliveries of lead from England prior to the conflict, stating that it was for the roof of his castle, but in reality, his smiths turned the lead into bullets. O'Neill's rebellion and victory at Clontibret left the English government in a nightmare scenario. Ulster was only accessible to a field army at 2 points: Bagenal's base in Newry to the east and Sligo in the west. All of the countryside between was either heavily forested, mountainous, or bog wetlands. The Sligo Pass was very heavily protected by O'Donnell, while Newry too provided abundant drumlin country and narrow points in which to conceal an ambush. A single positive for the Crown forces were the small fortified colonies at Belfast and Carrickfergus, each occupied by a few hundred men and providing the potential for an amphibious landing on the Foyle River, thus limiting O'Neill's abilities to move out of Ulster. In the southeast, Thomas Butler, the Earl of Ormond and Ossory, remained with his distant cousin, Elizabeth's cause, but it was the Crown in any case that was forced to operate on a number of fronts. The Wicklow rebel, Fia MacHugh O'Byrne, who had defeated a large English host at Glenmalure in 1580, also joined the Confederacy and followed up with raids and attacks on the southeastern areas of Carlow, Laois, Kilkenny, and Wexford. Even the suburbs of the Pale like Crumlin were soon put to waste. Meanwhile, the southwestern province of Munster had only been pacified and planted with English colonists in the previous decade. The confiscated Irish land was often sold at just a few pence per acre. Naturally, those displaced were hostile to the occupation of their ancestral home, and the Dublin administration knew as a result that Munster was also a powder keg. It was only at the start of the 1597 campaigning season that the Crown administration felt secure enough to mount an expedition in force at O'Neill's Ulster stronghold. Newly appointed Lord Deputy of Ireland, Thomas Burgh, advanced north with an army of 1,500 men, including 300 cavalry, moving from Newry on the 12th of July toward the town of Armagh. His objective was to devastate the lands of Tyrone and clear the English forts at the Foyle for a future advance. After passing through Armagh town, however, he found that O'Neill had built a fortification over the Blackwater. It was a timber structure, and Burgh managed to clear it after a sharp exchange. He advanced to the western bank, but Confederate forces skirmished for the area, making use of the Calaver arquebus. Ultimately, Burgh was unable to make further progress. Instead, he constructed a new fort, fighting off Confederate attacks, before withdrawing to deal with threats from rebels in the Midlands. Burgh's garrison managed to hold the Blackwater through the use of cannon, though they were hard-pressed. But Burgh's death from typhus midway through October was another blow to the Crown forces. O'Neill immediately sent reinforcements to his Leinster allies to threaten the Pale, and turned away from the Blackwater to raid Carrickfergus. Half of the garrison there perished, and the head of the commander, Sir John Chichester, was taken by O'Neill's forces. A truce over the winter and spring allowed both sides some respite, but the garrison on the Blackwater remained besieged. An English plan for the long-awaited amphibious landing in the Foyle was discovered by O'Neill, and hostilities resumed at the end of June 1598. By this time, Bagenal had received reinforcements from England, and he was fervent in taking the role as O'Neill's nemesis once more. Bagenal and his force of 3,500 infantry and 350 cavalry departed Armagh town on the morning of the 14th of August. The army was split into 3 sections for the march, with the cavalry divided between the vanguard and the rear echelon. Bagenal was positioned in this section, along with the army's supply wagons and its artillery. Each section was then divided again into 2 regiments, 6 in total, and Bagenal appears to have moved between the rear and the middle in the early morning. The column possessed 4 artillery pieces, one of which was a large 2.5 to 3,000 pound cannon, referred to as a saker. Sakers were de rigueur in continental armies, and their utility to set peace battles and siege was self-evident. They were not, however, suited to the boggy, soft ground that lay between Armagh town and the Blackwater fort, even in the pleasant August late summer, and Bagenal's piece began to sink and necessitate general stops almost as soon as the column started its 4-mile journey. The hindrance was compounded when it broke a wheel. 2 captains, Percy and Cosby, commanded the vanguard of the English army, while 2 others named Lee and Turner led a detached group at the very spear point of the column, projecting an air of confidence as they smoked their pipes while riding in the agreeable morning breeze. Bagenal's second, Sir Thomas Maria Wingfield, commanded the middle regiments, and at the outset of the march, the 3 main sections were to be divided by a distance of about 100 yards. Captains Billings and Cuny had command of the rear. The trail to the Blackwater was lined with scrub forest almost as soon as the environs of Armagh ended, and a column came under fire from Irish skirmishers after just half a mile. The fire was heavy enough to motivate the advance company to press forward, but not so heavy as to compel its leaders to call for a halt to the march and engage the attackers. Sir Thomas Percy, leading the vanguard, was particularly agitated to continue the march and move at a faster pace, but the baggage and artillery were unable to keep up, particularly the saker, and in any case, the vast majority of the English army was composed of pikemen, with musketeers posted in an outer ring to provide defensive fire. Bagenal's force also made use of what was called loose shot, groups of 3 to 4 musketeers who operated about 40 yards out on the main column's flank, engaging the Irish ambush parties and attempting to keep them at a safe distance for the army to continue its march. Nevertheless, a combination of Percy's impatience, the constant harassment from Confederate forces, and the snail's pace of the artillery and baggage at the rear meant that the 3 main sections of the army became further and further detached from one another as the morning continued. O'Neill had further aggravated Bagenal's passage by felling trees and digging pits in the road, which compelled the English ranks to move off and take to the increasing number of drumlins to the side, moving them to higher ground where they were choice targets for Irish calavers. Casualties were still light when the advance section crossed the Callan River, an easy task for infantry in the season, as the river was little more than a trickling stream, though the ground around it was particularly soft. From there, Percy led his men northwest across the drumlins and then to a pair of hills, the second of which was under a mile from the Blackwater River and a fort on the far side. Though Percy was unaware at the time, the baggage and artillery had become mired at the Callan, the marshy floodplain giving way like butter under the wheel of wagons, and especially the 3,000-pound Saker. Keen to escape the relentless prickling fire of the Irish ambush parties, Percy went over the hill and then made a singular discovery. O'Neill's forces had dug a wide trench in the valley between the 2 hills, reaching a mile in either direction, and then used the displaced soil to create an earthwork rampart on its far side, topped with impediments, sharp brambles, and thorny branches. After approaching this barrier cautiously and finding that there were no guards on the other side, Percy's regiments came under heavy fire from the flanks once more, their loose shot unable to counter the opposing numbers, and he gave the order to cross the trench and embankment. It was a difficult and painful ordeal, as the rate of fire from the Irish increased while the pikemen and musketeers struggled to get past the obstacles. Bagenal's cavalry found the trench and barriers completely impassable and were unable to move forward. Remaining defiant, the vanguard passed the obstruction and crested another hill. From this vantage point, the Blackwater Fort and its defenders were visible, and the garrison began cheering at the sight of Percy's company. By this time, however, Bagenal's army was strung out in 3 different locations. The artillery and baggage were still caught at the River Callan, the middle section was at the hill just before the trench, and Percy's command was highly exposed on the next hill just before the Blackwater. The attacks from the Confederates had continued unceasingly, and Percy found himself both furious with the rest of the army for not keeping pace, and also alarmed by the fact that his loose-shot skirmishers had suddenly run out of ammunition. They retreated to the cover of the pike ranks, and now O'Neill's men closed in force and were freely able to fire on Percy's regiments from a distance of 10 or 15 meters, or just under 50 feet. Worse, Bagenal sent word from the middle section that Percy was to return to the main body of the army. As the 2 regiments of the vanguard came about and attempted to go back the way they had come, disorder was inevitable, and the Irish saw that their opportunity had arrived. After another devastating round of fire, targeteers and horsemen swept onto the back of the English army, emerging from nowhere, cutting them down and starting a general rout. The trench and thorny obstacles on top of the earthwork that had been mysteriously undefended when Percy arrived now acted as the gate of a trap, pinning the greater part of Percy's regiments in place, while those at the front fought to flee and fell into the pit, only to be trampled, crushed, and suffocated by the hundreds who fell in after them. Riding to the front, the full calamity of O'Neill's scheme and the unfolding slaughter became apparent to Bagenal. While he had thought his army of near 4,000 men invulnerable to hit and run attacks, O'Neill had put together a force of 5,000, drawing on his ally O'Donnell and other clans from Connaught, luring Bagenal and his captains like livestock onto a killing ground. Bagenal was moving down to the trench, attempting to bring some kind of order as well as reinforcement to Percy's swiftly disintegrating regiments, when he raised the visor of his helm and was immediately shot through the face. Their leader gone, Bagenal's regiments blocked those of Percy's retreating ranks, and the confusion became manifold. Those coming back over the trench were stepping on the corpses of their comrades, only to run into their newly arrived support, and every one of them fell into a hopeless tangle. The Confederates were still firing from the sides, while O'Neill's cavalry and targeteers were finishing off the regiments that were on top of the third hill. Wingfield took command and attempted to exert control, even perhaps rally a counterattack to press on to the fort. Once a threadbare order was re-established at the trench, 2 units from the Middle Company actually passed over it and started to engage the Irish on the far side. The 4 pieces of artillery also appear to have come into range and been put to use by their operators. Another of the regiments, likely from the 3rd Army section, was in the process of crossing the barrier, and Wingfield appeared to be salvaging something from the debacle when an unnamed soldier attempted to replenish his supply of gunpowder and inadvertently put his hand inside the barrel while still holding a match for his musket. The resulting explosion ignited a number of other gunpowder barrels, and masses of English soldiers in the vicinity died instantly, others suffering grievous wounds. While the survivors staggered and screamed in the aftermath, their sight clouded by a blinding curtain of smoke, the Irish emerged again from the murk and began attacking the remnants of the English lines. Wingfield decided that the cause was lost, and with the supply wagons having finally cleared the River Callan only to come under immediate attack and ruination from O'Neill's forces, he gave the order to retreat. The entire column reversed its direction, Wingfield overseeing the operation and Cosby in command of the remnants of the vanguard, now forming a battered rear. Wingfield's attempts to keep command and stability in the face of the untiring attacks were yet again thrown into turmoil when Cosby launched a bizarre counterattack at the Irish forces, pursuing the English behind the trench. This necessitated Cosby to cross back over the trench and the earthwork behind, and his men were inexorably mauled and cut to pieces. Wingfield was forced to lead a cavalry detachment back to cover hundreds of soldiers now in danger, and Cosby himself was taken prisoner. When Wingfield returned to the front of the column, he found that O'Neill had led his own main forces laterally over the hills to try and cut the English army off from the high ground. But the English artillery pieces kept them from descending, and Wingfield managed to work his army back over the Callan and on to Armagh, where they could find sanctuary. Miraculously for him and his remaining men, the Irish guns also fell silent, their own ammunition spent, and the column was able to stumble into Armagh by the evening. Thomas Percy, who had led his forward command away from the main body of Bagenal's forces, only to be eradicated on the hill before the Blackwater, also survived, and he maintained to the end of his life that the fault lay with the slow-moving artillery and baggage sections. On the Irish side, the shortcomings of O'Neill's military reforms became acute as Wingfield orchestrated his escape. Both the Irish and the English army had run short of gunpowder, but O'Neill's transformed force was now overwhelmingly made up of infantry armed with caliver and arquebus. Had O'Neill possessed a strong force of traditional Galloglas, strong mobile infantry that could have charged en masse, or a coordinated cavalry, he could have destroyed the English army in its entirety. As it was, the Irish victory was undeniably total. More than half of Bagenal's force was dead, wounded, or in case of hundreds of Irish soldiers on the English side, gone over to the enemy. Some 300 were thought to have deserted and joined the Confederates. Fully 700 of the survivors had lost their weapons in the chaos of battle. By contrast, O'Neill's losses were just 200 men. Advancing and surrounding the town, O'Neill threatened an attack on Armagh should the English forces remain, and there was little that the defenders could do to contradict him. Under terms agreed between the Confederates and the Crown, the Blackwater Fort and Armagh were evacuated. The destruction of the field army sent reverberations around the court of Queen Elizabeth I. While Munster came out in open rebellion in its wake, the Queen's favourite, the Earl of Essex, arrived the next year with an army of 17,000, proclaiming to all that he was the man who would bring O'Neill to account. His campaign would founder in even worse circumstances than Bagenal's. Meanwhile in Madrid, Philippe II of Spain began making plans to send his own army to Ireland, O'Neill's success indicating that the Habsburg monarchy had finally found the route to conquer the Protestant regime of England. O'Neill's war was only half finished. If you stayed around this far, thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment as a sacrifice to the algorithm. You can also support us on Patreon and get ad-free early access to our videos for as little as $1, or by clicking the thanks button below to leave a one-time tip. As always, we'll see you in the next one.